These things are great. It's a piece of track from Festool. You get them with their routers or circular saws or track saws, that kind of thing. And I don't know about you, but whenever I try and clamp a straight edge to a workpiece to use my circular saw on it, whatever kind of clamp I choose, it hits this or some other part of the circular saw. This thing has a track underneath into which you can run these clamps. And that means they don't show above, and you can have them as narrow or as wide as you want. And they can go really wide because you can join these track sections together. So I've been using the circular saw on this piece of wood here. It's yet another piece of wood from the seemingly inexhaustible supply of timber from the old IKEA bed. And one of the kids needs a desk, so I'm going to be making a desk, and I've started on the top here. So I've used the circular saw, I've cut the quite long countertop down to a size that will fit in the destination room. And this video is going to be about grain, it's going to be about securing tabletops, and it's going to be about legs, leg faces and leg tapers. This is the main beam from the bed. It's a really solid piece of, I assume, slow-grown pine. But if you're going to put your child 5 feet above the ground, you want something strong. And 18 years on, it's still as straight as a very straight thing. So I'm going to get the legs out of this. If you just used the table legs as they are, it would be functional, but it would look as though you just nailed a few bits of wood together, and of course, essentially, you have. But to make it look a little bit more elegant, as though you knew what you were doing and were a fine cabinet maker, typically you put a taper on the legs. And the question is, do you taper all 4 sides, or do you only taper 2 sides? And the general wisdom seems to be that if you taper all 4 sides, you get a delicate and spindly look. If you just taper 2 sides, you get a sort of an elegant and slightly optically illusory look of a curve to it. I'm going to go for tapering 2 faces, and there is a bonus advantage with doing that. You only need 1 jig. We're going to have to make a jig to present the wood to the saw blade at an angle, and the angle face of the jig will present itself to one of the non-tapered sides. And I will be tapering this side with the curved corners. I didn't have enough wood to remove. So I'll be tapering that face, and then I'll come to taper a second face, and I've still got an untapered face to place against the jig. If you went on to taper face 3 and then face 4, you would come to a tapered face against the jig, and the angle would have changed. So you would need an adjustable jig or 2 jigs. How much of an angle? Really, you just have to try it out. I'm not going to taper right the way up to the top. I'm going to leave a flat section for the apron. And if I was to apply that taper to what remains, it looks a bit extreme to me. So I'm going to go for, what we've got here is 44 millimeters at the top. I'm going to go not for 20 something, but for 30 millimeters at the bottom. Now, when I was thinking vaguely about the video and what I would say, I assumed I'd be talking in terms of the angle of taper. But it turns out to be a little pointless, as it is so shallow. That looks a significant taper to the eye, but in fact it turns out to be 1.2 degrees. And I wouldn't fancy setting anything to 1.2 degrees. If you don't remember your sine and your cos and your tan from your school trigonometry, you need to put your calculator into fancy mode, and you need to calculate this ratio. That length there, which is 660 millimeters, and this height here, which is 14 millimeters. So if we divide 14 by 660, we get what's called the tan, or tangent, but that's confusing. Tangents mean other things. And we can ask the calculator in fancy mode, what is the angle whose tangent is that? And it tells us it's 1.2 degrees. Well, I've knocked together my taper jig. I've put a mark at this end where I want the taper to stop. I would like about 10 centimeters left square at the top where the apron will fit. So using the square here, I can set up this end and add a toggle clamp. And down this end I have a shoe. You have a choice here. You could cut that way. The advantage of that is that the blade is presented into the workpiece. The disadvantage of cutting it this way is that the blade will enter the workpiece at a glancing angle and will tend to deviate slightly at the top. So I've got to take it slowly, and I may have to just trim it with a smoothing plane. The reason for going with this orientation is down at the other end here where this shoe is. If we were cutting that way, then the slope of this part of the shoe would tend to be sliding the workpiece out and pinching the blade. Whereas this way, if any forces tend to slide the leg at all, they'll be sliding it into the shoe and away from the blade. And as we know, of course, you never want anything to come in and pinch the spinning blade. I've cut out the aprons, and now I'm trying to lay things so that all the blemishes are hidden. The battered surface of the top is going to form the underside. I've got the curvy bits that I wasn't able to cut off if I wanted to keep the legs square, facing inward and backward where possible. I'm rather irritated I missed a blemish here where there was a dowel I didn't see, but I've managed to get those at what will form the back of the table. And you may be wondering, why no front apron? Well, more on that in a moment. Joining table legs to a table apron is the perfect place to use pocket holes, as it's all hidden. And using the handy table that I was talking about in the last video, we see that if you're drilling the pockets into 25mm or 1-inch wood, and the receiving piece is 44mm, well, it maxes out at 1.5 inches here, then we're told to use the 1-inch jig setting and 2-inch screws. The main thing you have to be careful about is where two aprons meet one leg. You want the screws obviously not to intersect, so I've made some marks here. Go low on this piece and I'll be going higher on the other piece. Starting at the front though, where it doesn't matter, there is only one apron. And the second reason for using pocket holes is that this desk needs to be broken down for transport, so mortise and tenon, anything with glue, isn't going to be quite so appropriate. Now, some practicalities, a pet peeve, the reason for the absence of a front apron, and the challenges that that presents. This isn't really wide enough for two sets of pedestal drawers. And one set wouldn't look very nice and you'd be squeezed into just one end of the desk. So I'm going for a single pair of top hung drawers. The peeve is this distance here. I've worked typing at desks for nigh on 30 years, and what you want is to respect this distance here. With your thigh and your arm parallel, you've only got about 6 inches here. And if you have a massive great drawer in here, or a drawer with a top and bottom frame to it, then there isn't room to get your legs underneath and be typing at a comfortable typing height. So these are going to have shallow drawers. They'll be about 4 inches, and there'll be no frame around them. So they'll be, if you like, all drawer. When it comes to attaching the top to the frame, you need to bear in mind the direction of the wood fibres. Typically in the top, and certainly in mine, the fibres run this way. But in the apron sides, the fibres run this way. And wood fibres are funny things. When I come to cook this spaghetti, or I suppose if we're being precise, linguine, but if it were spaghetti, it's going to absorb some water. And when it absorbs the water, it will expand, and it will expand uniformly. These will expand in diameter, and they will also expand in length. But wood fibres are not like that. Wood fibres, which are essentially nutrient transport tubes, expand in diameter, but they don't expand much in length. So as the top absorbs and loses water, it will expand and contract in this direction. And the aprons and the drawer hanger here won't. So if I attached it in the obvious way by securing it here and here and here and here and here and so forth, then come the seasonal expansions and contractions, the top is either going to pull the constituent board pieces apart, or it's going to push them together and the tabletop will want to bow or cup. And it'll certainly put a lot of stresses into the frame. So you can't secure a tabletop to a frame in the obvious way. You have to give it room to move. Now I don't have an apron at the front because of my drawers and thigh height peeve. So I do want to secure here in the obvious way with a pocket hole down through the side apron into the top, and the same thing down at the other end, and that way I'll stabilise this dimension of the table frame. But over at the back here I'm going to machine a groove, and into that groove I'm going to fit some clips made out of this piece of hardwood here that just happens from some other project, I've forgotten what, to have the correct shape to form a clip lip over there. Now I'm going to thin this down a little bit, it's rather bulky at the moment. And as I say, machine a groove into there, probably using the biscuit cutter. And then this will act as a clip. I'll leave a millimetre clearance underneath it, and I'll put that in there and I'll screw that down, and it will pull the table to the back apron and secure it there. But with a little bit of a gap left here as well, then the tabletop will have room to move both away from this clip and towards this clip without suffering any stress. Got to make sure there's a gap at the back and underneath, otherwise the expansion that this is to support can't happen. I'm temporarily attaching the rail that will hold the drawer runner. Eventually, when I attach the runner, the screws will go right the way through this rail and into the apron, and then I'll remove these. I've also put a note to myself, there was actually room for a clip here without the drawer side fouling it. So I put a note to myself that the runner and rail have to come off in order to access that clip, because of course I shan't remember. I've cut myself out a spacer that fits exactly between the drawer runners. So this would be the front if I was going to butt the side pieces behind it. But this is another place where you can use pocket screws, pocket joinery, and if you do so, you want it like that. You want the butt joint to have the front and the back inside, because the pocket holes are going to come in from here and be hidden on this by a false front, and a similar thing will happen on the back, but they'll come in from here and they'll be hidden because they'll be at the back. So I just need to reduce my spacers width by 2 half-inch ply widths, and then I'll be ready to go. I have the drawer sides made and sitting between the runners, and as we said, the pocket holes will be hidden at the front here by the false front, and the pocket holes at the back are at the back and you can't see them. I've cut the bottom out of 6mm ply. It would be nice to be able to fit it into a groove. You don't get a great deal of extra strength from that, but you do get a couple of advantages. First of all, sitting in a groove, it helps you keep the sides square, although these sides are actually pretty good. There's just a slight bow here, which I shall have to correct a little bit later and in a different way. The other advantage from using grooves and sliding the bottom in via the back and screwing into the back is that the bottoms are removable and replaceable, and they do tend to suffer the most damage in a desk with leaking pens and upset bottles of Tipex and so forth. However, these are already shallow enough at 100mm. If I was to fit the base into a housing, a groove, then I would lose more height. So it's going to have to be glued and pinned. They won't be easy to replace, and it's going to be slightly more challenging to square up that little bow there, for example. Incidentally, if you want more details on making drawers this way with a groove, have a look at the video by Jay Bates on drawer construction. To secure the drawer carcasses to the runners, I'm following the suggestion of John Hyes, which is to use shims to give yourself the clearance here, here, here and here, of course all of the same size, and to set the runners where they should be, which in this particular kind of runner is flush with the raw carcass and thus to be hidden by the false front. And then keeping those runners in the right place and withdrawing the drawer and runner together, you gradually expose each screw hole and you can secure the screw into it. Not Posi-Drive screws. Yuck. The false fronts for the drawers are ready, and I've put a couple of coats of Danish oil on. I realised with some of the other pieces, when I was sanding them off, if you leave one side coated and the other side bare, even for a day, it starts to absorb moisture and warp. So I think one of the reasons this wood from the old bed has done so well is because it was coated with a good Danish oil long, long, long ago. The other job to do is to fit a rail down here to carry a brace that's going to go up to the hanger here at 45 degrees to compensate for the absence of an apron around the front there where we've just got drawer fronts. Now the tapers of these legs I chose to put on the inside. I could have had them on the outside. I thought it looked slightly better with the tapers on the inside. So that cross rail is going to have a slight taper at either end. To do that, I'll use the same jig as I used to put the taper on, but this time on a crosscut sled. And the workpiece is quite a bit longer. The forces are not down the length of the workpiece, the forces are down into the width of the workpiece, so I simply need to remove this stump here. To fit the end of my rail to the legs, I've only got room for one hidden pocket hole, which will be coming from underneath. So I'm having to drill the pocket hole end on, which is not convenient. So I've put a couple of pieces of wood here and clamped them on to stop that twisting as I drill the pocket. And for vertical stability, there'll also be a dowel in there. I was reading some debate somewhere in some comments or in a forum about the value of using a tiny Forstner bit and why not just use a brad point. Surely there'd be no advantage to the Forstner bit. Well, here's an example of an advantage. I've cut the strut, which is going to angle up from the rail at the back to the drawer hanger and lend some strength to the front of the desk, and I want to fix it with a couple of screws. I want this whole thing, as I've said, to be dismantleable. And I would like the screws to have counterbores so that the heads are hidden, a bit like a pocket hole. It's just not at the right angle to be considered a pocket hole. But drilling into a face at an angle is very difficult unless you have a good drill press, a good vise and a Forstner bit. And it will very successfully drill at an angle. You want this turning fairly fast and to go fairly gently. I'm using pocket hole screws again because they have the nice built-in washer and a panned head. To fit the false front, you need the drawer in its closed position, which of course makes marking up slightly awkward. So I put the screws in from the other side with their points protruding, and that should allow me to place this, give it a knock and get it set. Oh, and I've taken a little hand recess out of here as I don't particularly want to fit any kind of knob or handle to the front. So with the shims underneath and with the drawer in place and with the screws sticking out and with a little bit of a waggle, we can knock this onto those points and get our marks. And then put some pilot holes in and some screws.